The wind that night wasn't just strong. It was prehistoric, the kind of wind that must have existed before humans learned to build shelters, before any living thing dared to challenge the mountains. Thomas Brennan pressed his palm against the window of his cabin and felt the glass bow inward, just slightly, just enough to remind him that nature was testing every joint, every nail, every decision he'd made in reinforcing the structure over his 15 years in these mountains. He'd been a wildlife biologist long enough to respect weather, but this storm was different. The Weather Service had used words they rarely used: historic, catastrophic, unsurvivable if caught exposed. They'd been evacuating the lower villages for 2 days, but Thomas had stayed. Someone had to. The research station held 15 years of irreplaceable data, cameras that needed protecting, and most importantly, he knew animals would need help after this passed. They always did after the bad storms, emerging confused and hungry, their hunting grounds transformed into an alien landscape of ice and snow. The thermometer outside his window had stopped working at -35. That was 3 hours ago. The wind chill would put it closer to -50, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in under a minute, cold enough to make breathing dangerous, cold enough to kill even the hardy mountain wildlife that had evolved to survive here. Thomas was adjusting the damper on his wood stove, trying to maximize heat while conserving his wood supply, when he heard the first sound. He froze, hands still on the metal lever, listening. His first thought was that something had come loose outside, a piece of equipment or roofing. But then it came again, rhythmic, deliberate. 3 scrapes, pause. 3 scrapes, pause. Pattern meant intelligence. Pattern meant purpose. His mind cycled through possibilities. A lost hiker was most likely someone who'd ignored the evacuation orders, maybe a thrill seeker trying to experience the storm of the century. He grabbed his emergency medical kit, already mentally running through the treatment protocol for severe hypothermia. He pulled on his insulated gloves, knowing that even opening the door would be dangerous in these conditions. The door fought him, the wind pressure differential making it feel like it weighed hundreds of pounds. He managed to crack it open, and the cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, making his eyes water instantly. Through the tears and the horizontal snow, he saw something that his brain simply refused to process for several seconds. A snow leopard, not crouched in hunting posture, not passing by accidentally, but sitting upright like a house cat, looking directly at him. The impossibility of it made him question his vision, made him wonder if the cold had already affected his brain. Snow leopards didn't do this. They were ghosts, shadows, creatures that researchers could spend decades trying to glimpse. They didn't sit on doorsteps. They certainly didn't maintain eye contact with humans. But those eyes, even through the storm, he could see them clearly. Pale green like sea ice, and in them was something that made his breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. Recognition. This wasn't a random leopard. This was her. 6 months ago, almost to the day, he'd been doing a routine survey in the restricted conservation area, the place where tourists weren't allowed, where even researchers needed special permits. He'd been tracking a male leopard's movements when he heard the screaming. People who've never heard an animal in real agony think they can imagine it, but they can't. It's a sound that bypasses your ears and goes straight to your spine, triggering evolutionary responses older than language. Thomas had run toward it without thinking, crashing through snow drifts, following the terrible sound to its source. The trap had been a professional job, not some amateur snare. Heavy steel jaws with teeth designed to hold without cutting completely through to keep the animal alive and the pelt intact. It was wrapped around her front left leg, just above the paw, and she'd clearly been there for days. The blood in the snow had frozen and thawed and frozen again in layers, creating a gruesome calendar of her suffering. She'd fought him at first, of course. Even exhausted, even dying, she was 200 pounds of muscle and instinct. But infection had set in, and her strength was failing. Thomas had managed to inject her with a sedative, watching her eyes go from fury to confusion to finally, mercifully, unconsciousness. The trap had been worse than he'd initially thought. The metal teeth had cut through muscle, chipped bone, introduced bacteria deep into tissue that had then festered in the wet, cold conditions. He cleaned it as best he could with his field supplies, used every antibiotics dose he had, wrapped it with all his bandages. He'd been preparing a second sedative dose to keep her under while he radioed for help when she'd suddenly lurched to her feet. The sedative should have lasted another hour at least, but he'd miscalculated. Starvation and infection had altered her metabolism, processed the drugs faster than expected. She'd stood there, swaying, looking at him with those pale green eyes, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she turned and limped into the forest, moving faster than should have been possible with her injuries. He tried to follow, but she'd vanished like smoke. 3 days he'd searched, finding occasional blood drops, disturbed snow, but never her. His colleagues had helped him set up camera traps, scoured the area, but after 2 weeks with no sightings, they'd drawn the obvious conclusion. She'd crawled somewhere hidden to die, as wild animals do. Thomas had carried the guilt for 6 months. He should have been more careful with the sedative dosage. Should have worked faster. Should have somehow done more. The image of her limping away, leaving a trail of blood in pristine snow, had haunted his dreams. Yet here she was, alive against all odds, sitting at his door in a storm that was breaking 100-year records. But something was wrong with the picture. She wasn't moving like a wild animal should, wasn't showing the typical stress responses. She was too still, too focused, too deliberate. And that's when he saw what she held in her mouth. The cub was tiny, maybe 2 weeks old, hanging from her jaws like a wet rag. No movement, no sound. Thomas's mind raced through the implications. Snow leopard mothers were legendary for their devotion, but they didn't do this. They didn't bring cubs to humans. The behavioral gulf was too vast, the instinct too strong. Unless... She stood slowly, favoring the leg that had been trapped. Even from the doorway, Thomas could see the damage. The wound had healed badly, leaving a mass of scar tissue that had contracted, pulling her leg into a permanent partial bend. She must be in constant pain, and hunting would be agony. In normal conditions, she might manage, but in this storm, with cubs to feed, she walked past him into his cabin like she'd done it 1,000 times before. No hesitation at the doorway, no fear response to entering an enclosed space that should trigger every claustrophobic instinct her species possessed. She moved through his living room with purpose, heading for the far corner, away from the door, away from the wind. There, on his grandmother's old braided rug, she gently placed the cub. Thomas approached slowly, telegraphing every movement. The cub was in bad shape. Female, he noted automatically, the part of his brain that was still a scientist cataloging details even as the rest of him grappled with the impossibility of the situation. Her body temperature was dangerously low, her gums pale, her breathing so shallow he had to place his hand on her tiny chest to confirm she was alive. He grabbed towels from his bathroom, blankets from his closet, creating a nest near, but not too near the fire. Too much heat too fast could kill her as surely as the cold. He began rubbing her gently with the towel, stimulating circulation, checking her paws and tail for frostbite. The pads were cold, but not frozen. The tail tip worryingly purple, but not black. She might lose the tip, but she'd live. If he could get her warm, if he could get her breathing properly. The mother watched him work, then turned and walked back to the door. She stood there, waiting, and Thomas understood. There were more. The second trip took 12 minutes. Thomas knew because he watched the clock, anxiety building with each passing second. The mother returned with another cub, male, larger, crying weakly. A good sign. He had the energy to protest, the lung capacity to voice his displeasure. Thomas took him gratefully, adding him to the warming nest, watching with relief as the first cub stirred slightly at her brother's presence. The third trip took 18 minutes, then 25, then 30. Thomas found himself at the window, peering into the white void, seeing nothing but his own reflection and the swirling chaos beyond. The two cubs were warming up, their breathing steadier, but they needed their mother. They needed milk, antibodies, the comfort of her presence. When she finally appeared, what she carried made his heart sink. This cub wasn't moving at all. Another female, smaller than the first, completely limp. Thomas took her immediately, laying her on the kitchen table, starting CPR without conscious thought. 2 fingers compressing the tiny chest, gentle puffs of air into lungs no bigger than walnuts. The mother stood in the doorway, snow melting off her coat, watching. 1 minute passed. 2. 3. The cub remained lifeless. Thomas continued, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold air still flowing through the open door. For minutes. 5. In humans, brain damage would already be setting in. In cubs this young, already hypothermic, maybe there was more time. Maybe. At 6 minutes, just as Thomas was about to accept defeat, the cub gasped. A tiny hiccup of air, then a cough, then a thin, reedy wail that was the most beautiful sound Thomas had ever heard. He wrapped her quickly, carefully, placing her with her siblings. All 3 were crying now, weak but insistent, and their mother moved toward them. But instead of settling into nurse, she walked past them to the door again. Thomas's confusion lasted only a moment. Of course, snow leopards occasionally had 4 cubs, though 3 was more common. She must have had 4, and in conditions like these, transporting them one at a time to safety. The logistics were staggering. Where had she kept them between trips? How had she kept the waiting cubs from freezing? This time she was gone for 35 minutes. Thomas busied himself preparing what supplies he had. Kitten milk replacer. Thank God for the emergency veterinary kit. Heating pads designed for wildlife rehabilitation. Antibiotics, though he needed to calculate the dosage carefully for cubs this small. When she returned, she didn't carry a cub. Instead, she had a rabbit in her jaws. A mountain hare, probably caught days ago and cached, now frozen solid but still intact. She placed it carefully on the floor near her cubs and looked at Thomas. The message was clear. She was providing what she could, showing him she was a capable mother, but also acknowledging she needed help. Thomas understood. The injured leg wasn't just affecting her mobility, it was affecting her hunting success. She could still catch prey, but not enough, not consistently. In normal weather, she might supplement with smaller prey, maybe scavenge from other predators' kills. But this storm had locked down everything. Nothing was moving, nothing was hunting, nothing was dying where she could find it. She made a calculation, this wild leopard. Stay in whatever den she had and watch her cubs slowly starve and freeze, or make this impossible journey to the one human who had tried to help her before. How long had she been traveling? How many times had she stopped, gathered her courage, almost turned back? Thomas thawed the rabbit in warm water, then used his camping knife to cut it into small pieces. The mother ate mechanically, efficiently, wasting nothing. While she ate, Thomas prepared bottles of formula. The cubs needed more than their mother could provide right now. He lifted the first cub, the male, expecting resistance. Instead, the cub latched onto the artificial nipple immediately, desperately, drinking so fast Thomas had to pull the bottle away periodically to prevent him from choking. One by one, he fed them while their mother rested. She didn't sleep, he noticed. Her eyes remained open, tracking his every movement, but without the tension he'd expect. There was wariness, yes, but also something else. Trust wasn't quite the right word. Maybe acknowledgement. Recognition that in this moment, in this crisis, they were not predator and prey, not wild and civilized, but just 2 beings trying to keep 3 small lives from ending. As the night wore on, Thomas found himself talking to her. Quietly, steadily, the way he'd talk to any stressed animal he was treating. He told her about his life in these mountains, about the other leopards he'd studied, about the poachers he'd helped catch over the years. She probably understood none of it, but his voice seemed to calm her. Her eyes grew heavier, though they never fully closed. Around 3 in the morning, something shifted. The mother stood, stretched, and did something that made Thomas stop breathing. She picked up one of the cubs and brought it to him, placing it in his lap. Then she returned for the second, then the third, arranging them on and around him. Then she walked to the corner and lay down alone, watching. It took Thomas a moment to understand. She was letting him help, really help, not just provide shelter and food, but share in the care. She was acknowledging that right now, in this moment, he could keep them warmer than she could. His body heat, supplemented by the blankets and heating pad, was better than her wet, cold fur. The cubs settled against him, making tiny sounds of contentment. Thomas remained perfectly still, afraid to break whatever spell had allowed this to happen. Outside, the storm raged, shaking the cabin, screaming through the trees. Inside, a man sat surrounded by snow leopard cubs while their mother rested, trusting him with her entire world. By dawn, the wind had died to merely terrifying rather than apocalyptic. The cubs were stronger, their cries louder, more demanding. Thomas prepared another round of bottles while their mother groomed them, her rough tongue stimulating their circulation, encouraging them to eliminate waste, all the things mothers do that no substitute can truly replace. Thomas knew he should document this. It was groundbreaking, unprecedented. The first recorded instance of a wild snow leopard voluntarily seeking human assistance. The implications for understanding animal cognition, memory, decision-making were staggering. But he also knew what would happen if he reported it. The wildlife department would intervene immediately. They'd say the mother had become habituated, that she posed a risk to humans, that the cubs needed to be removed and raised in captivity to prevent them from learning this dangerous behavior. They'd capture the entire family, put them in a rehabilitation center that would really be a prison, and eventually, maybe, release the cubs somewhere far from here. The mother, with her injury and her unprecedented behavior, would never be released. She'd die in captivity, probably within months. So Thomas made a choice that went against every protocol, every regulation, every professional obligation. He would tell no one. He would take no photos, no video, collect no samples. He would help this family survive the storm and then let them disappear back into the wilderness, carrying their secret with them. The storm lasted 6 more days, longer than any storm in recorded history for this region. Each day followed a pattern. The mother would leave during the lightest snowfall, usually mid-morning, returning hours later. Sometimes she brought prey, a ptarmigan, another rabbit, once a young marmot she'd somehow extracted from its winter den. When she was successful, she'd eat, produce milk, nurse her cubs. When she wasn't, Thomas supplemented with formula. On the 3rd day, she began bringing the cubs to him automatically for their supplemental feeding, laying them in his lap with a soft chuff sound that seemed to mean your turn. The cubs began to recognize him, turning their heads toward his scent, calming at his touch. Their eyes weren't open yet, wouldn't be for another week, but they knew him by smell and sound and the particular rhythm of his heartbeat. On the 4th day, something extraordinary happened. Thomas was sitting on the floor, having just finished feeding the smallest female, the one he'd resuscitated. The mother approached him, moving with the deliberate care she always showed in the cabin. She sat next to him, close enough that their bodies touched, and then did something that made his vision blur with unexpected tears. She began grooming his hair. It was brief, just a few licks on the side of his head, the same way she groomed her cubs. Then she stood and returned to her corner as if nothing had happened, leaving Thomas sitting there trying to process what had just occurred. In her world, grooming was reserved for family, for cubs and siblings and mates. It was an intimate act, a bonding behavior. She had just, in her way, accepted him as part of her family unit. The 5th day brought new challenges. The smallest female developed a respiratory infection, probably from her near-death experience. Her breathing became labored, wet, the tiny chest working too hard for too little air. Thomas had antibiotics, but calculating the dose for a 2-week-old snow leopard cub was educated guesswork at best. He prepared what he hoped was right, mixed it with formula, and fed it to her drop by drop. The mother watched intently, and when the cub struggled to breathe, she did something remarkable. She positioned herself upright, holding the cub against her chest in an almost human posture, keeping the baby's airways elevated. She maintained that position for hours, even though it must have been uncomfortable, even though it went against every natural resting position for her species. By the 6th day, the storm was finally breaking. Gaps appeared in the clouds, revealing a landscape transformed. Drifts 20 feet high had reshaped the topology, buried familiar landmarks, created a new world of white. The temperature rose to merely deadly rather than instantly fatal. The cubs were thriving now. The antibiotics had worked, the smallest female breathing clearly. Their weight had increased, their cries were strong, and they had begun the preliminary squirming that would eventually become crawling. They still needed constant care, still needed supplemental feeding, but they would survive. On the 7th morning, Thomas woke to find the mother standing by the door with all 3 cubs lined up beside her. The message was clear. It was time to go. But there was a problem. The cubs couldn't survive a long journey yet, not in these conditions. They were too young, still needed constant warmth. Thomas tried to explain this to her, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping she might understand his intent. He brought the cubs back to the warm nest, showed her the thermometer outside, acted out shivering and cubs dying. She watched him patiently, then walked back to the door and sat, waiting. Then he understood. She wasn't planning to travel far. Somewhere nearby, probably very close, she had found or created a den that would work now that the worst had passed. She just needed to transport the cubs there, and she was asking him to help. Thomas had never followed a snow leopard to its den. No researcher had, as far as he knew. Dens were the most closely guarded secrets of these solitary cats, the one place they were truly vulnerable. But she was inviting him, trusting him with the location of her safe space. He bundled up in his best winter gear, knowing that even a short journey could be dangerous in these conditions. The mother picked up the largest cub and led the way. Thomas followed, carrying the 2 females in an insulated carrier he'd modified with heating packets. She led him up the slope behind his cabin, through a stand of pines he thought he knew well, but which the storm had transformed into an alien landscape. The journey was only about 300 yards, but in the deep snow, with the treacherous footing, it took almost an hour. The den was a work of genius. She'd found a rock overhang that created a natural cave, but at some point during the storm, snow had blown in at just the right angle to create an insulating wall across most of the entrance, leaving only a small opening for access. Inside, she'd gathered dry grass, moss, even some fabric that looked like it might have come from an old hiking tent abandoned somewhere on a mountain. The space was small, maybe 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, but it was dry and remarkably warm. The snow walls provided insulation. The rock reflected body heat, and the small entrance prevented wind infiltration. It was perfect except for one thing. She couldn't have kept newborn cubs alive here during the storm. It would work now, with the cubs older and stronger, but not 6 days ago when the temperature was 30 degrees colder and the cubs were newborn. Thomas helped her arrange the cubs in the den, making sure the bedding was properly positioned. The mother entered and curled around her babies, and they immediately began nursing, making small sounds of contentment. But before Thomas could leave, she looked at him and made a specific sound, a soft chirp he'd never heard from a snow leopard before. When he didn't respond, she did it again, more insistently. Cautiously, he leaned into the den entrance. She shifted, creating space beside her, and chirped again. The invitation was clear, but incomprehensible. She wanted him to stay. Wild snow leopards, don't invite humans into their dens. They don't share their most vulnerable spaces with potential threats. Yet she was doing exactly that. Thomas couldn't fit entirely inside, but he could sit at the entrance, his upper body in the warm space, and that seemed to satisfy her. They stayed that way for an hour, the cubs nursing, the mother resting, Thomas marveling at the trust being shown to him. When he finally left, she chirped once more, a sound he was beginning to understand meant acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. He returned the next day with supplemental food for her, chunks of venison from his freezer. She was out hunting, but he could hear the cubs inside, their cries stronger now. He left the meat at the den entrance and retreated. From a distance, he watched her return, sniff the offering, and carry it inside. This pattern continued for 2 weeks. Sometimes he'd see her, sometimes not, but he always left food. On the 10th day, when he arrived, she was waiting outside the den with something in her mouth. At first, he thought it was prey, but as he got closer, he realized it was a fragment of the bandage he'd wrapped around her leg 6 months ago. She must have kept it, carried it to her various dens, a token of, what? Memory? Gratitude? He couldn't know, but she placed it at his feet like a gift before returning to her cubs. On the 14th day, the cubs' eyes were opening. Thomas got to see them properly for the first time, 3 pairs of pale blue eyes that would eventually turn green like their mother's. They were starting to crawl, uncoordinated but determined, exploring their small world with increasing confidence. On the 20th day, disaster struck. Thomas arrived at the den to find blood in the snow and signs of a struggle. His heart hammering, he followed the tracks. Something had found the den. From the prints, it looked like a wolf, maybe more than one. The blood trail led up the slope, and Thomas ran, slipping, falling, getting up, running again. He found them a quarter mile up the mountain. The mother had moved the cubs to a cluster of rocks, pressing them into a crevice while she stood guard. There were 3 wolves circling, testing her defenses. She was injured, blood seeping from wounds on her shoulder and flank, but she stood firm, snarling, making herself look larger. Thomas didn't think, just acted. He charged down the slope, yelling, waving his arms, throwing chunks of ice and rock. The wolves scattered, more surprised than frightened, but it was enough. They retreated, looking back with the calculating gaze of predators, deciding if a fight was worth it. Thomas stood beside the mother, adding his presence to hers, and apparently, the combination was enough. The wolves melted back into the forest. The mother was hurt worse than he'd initially thought. The wolves had caught her away from the den, probably while she was hunting. She'd fought them off and raced back to move her cubs, but the damage was done. Deep puncture wounds on her shoulder, claw marks down her side, and worst of all, renewed damage to her already injured leg. Thomas did what he could with his field kit, cleaning wounds, applying antibiotics, but she needed more than he could provide here. She needed rest, safety, time to heal. But with 3 cubs dependent on her, rest was impossible. That's when Thomas made another decision that would have ended his career if anyone knew. He gathered up the cubs, all 3 of them, and started walking back to his cabin. The mother followed, limping badly, leaving spots of blood in the snow. He set up a space in his storage room, rarely used, windowless, quiet. He brought in straw from the supplies he kept for injured animals, set up heat lamps, created as close to a den as he could manage. The mother entered without hesitation, settling into the straw with obvious relief. For the next week, she barely moved, letting Thomas bring her food and water, letting him tend her wounds, letting him help with the cubs when she was too weak. The cubs thrived, unaware of the drama, content with warmth and milk and safety. On the 4th day of this arrangement, something happened that changed everything Thomas thought he knew about interspecies communication. He was sitting beside the mother, having just finished treating her wounds, when she placed her paw on his hand. Not aggressively, not accidentally, but deliberately, maintaining the contact while looking directly at him. Then she did something extraordinary. She began to purr. Snow leopards can't purr like house cats. They lack the specialized hyoid bone that allows continuous purring. But they can make a similar sound, a rhythmic chuffing that serves the same social function. It's a sound of contentment, of trust, of familial bonding. Mothers do it with cubs, siblings with each other, mates during courtship. But never, in any literature Thomas had read, did they do it with humans. Yet here she was, her paw on his hand, making that sound while maintaining eye contact. The message transcended species, transcended language. It was pure emotion, pure communication at its most fundamental level. Thank you. I trust you. We are connected. Thomas sat there, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had allowed this moment. The cubs tumbled around them, playing with increasing coordination, occasionally climbing over his legs or their mother's back. The injured leopard continued her rhythmic chuffing, and Thomas found himself humming in response, a low, tuneless sound that seemed to harmonize with hers. They stayed that way for an hour, maybe more. Time seemed irrelevant in that small, warm space. A man and a leopard and 3 cubs, connected by circumstance and choice, by kindness offered and received, by trust built through crisis. By the end of the week, the mother was healing well. The wounds were closing, the infection controlled, her strength returning. The cubs were a month old now, starting to show personality. The male was bold, always the first to explore new things. The larger female was cautious but curious, watching before acting. The smaller female, the one Thomas had resuscitated, was the most social, always seeking contact with her siblings or mother. It was this smallest female who did something that would stay with Thomas forever. He was bottle-feeding her one evening, supplementing her mother's milk as he'd done from the beginning. She finished and, for the first time, opened her eyes fully and looked directly at him. Her eyes were still blue but starting to show flecks of green. She reached up with one tiny paw and touched his face, the pad soft and warm against his cheek. Then she did something cubs usually only do with their mothers. She began to knead, the instinctive motion that stimulates milk flow, but in this context, it was pure affection. She kneaded against his cheek while making a tiny chirping sound, a baby version of her mother's vocalization. In her small, limited understanding of the world, he was family. The mother watched this interaction without intervening, and when Thomas looked at her, she slow blinked, the universal cat gesture of trust and acceptance. In that moment, the boundary between human and wild animal didn't just blur, it dissolved entirely. As the second week in his storage room began, Thomas knew they needed to return to the wild soon. The cubs were becoming more active, needing more space, more stimulation. The mother was hunting successfully again, bringing prey back to the cabin area. But there was a problem. The original den had been compromised. The wolves knew its location, and they'd be back. Together, in a partnership Thomas could never have imagined, they searched for a new den site. The mother would lead, Thomas would follow, and they'd evaluate options. She showed him places he'd never have found alone, hidden spots known only to the creatures that lived their entire lives in these mountains. But none were quite right. Too exposed, too damp, too close to wolf territory, too far from hunting grounds. Then, on the third day of searching, Thomas remembered something. Years ago, he'd discovered a cave system while tracking a male leopard. It was well hidden, multiple chambers dry, with a narrow entrance that would be easy to defend. He'd noted it in his research, but never explored it fully. He led her there, feeling slightly absurd. A human showing a snow leopard potential den sites went against the natural order so fundamentally that he had no framework for processing it. But she followed, carrying one cub, while he carried the other 2 in the modified carrier. The cave was perfect, better than perfect. The entrance was hidden behind a fall of rocks that created a natural barrier. Inside, the main chamber was spacious and dry, with smaller chambers branching off. There was even a small spring in the back, trickling fresh water year-round. The mother explored every inch, sniffing, testing, evaluating. Then she turned to Thomas and chuffed, that sound he'd come to recognize as approval. They spent the rest of the day moving her supplies to the new den. Thomas brought straw and blankets from his cabin. She gathered moss and grass from exposed patches where the snow had melted. Together, they created a space that would be safe and warm for the cubs as they grew. That night, their last in his cabin, the mother did something that broke Thomas's heart with its trust. She brought all 3 cubs to him and then left, disappearing into the darkness. She was gone for 3 hours, and when she returned, she carried a freshly killed deer calf, small enough to drag but large enough to feed her for days. She had gone hunting specifically to ensure she'd have food stored, so she could spend uninterrupted time with him on their last night together. It was planning, foresight, emotional intelligence that science said these animals didn't possess. Yet here was proof, dragging a deer calf across his floor, evidence of cognition that transcended instinct. They spent that last night like a strange family. The cubs played climbing on Thomas, chewing his bootlaces, pouncing on shadows. The mother rested beside him, occasionally grooming a cub that wandered by, sometimes grooming Thomas's hair as she'd done before. He talked to them, telling stories they couldn't understand, expressing emotions he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. He told them about his life before the mountains, about the university where he'd studied, the concrete jungle he'd escaped from. He told them about his research, the papers he'd published, the scientific community that would never believe what was happening here. He told them about loneliness, about choosing isolation to study these magnificent creatures, never expecting to connect with one so profoundly. The mother listened, or seemed to, her eyes half closed but her ears tracking his voice. Once, when his voice broke with emotion he didn't expect, she pressed her head against his shoulder, holding it there in what could only be interpreted as comfort. Morning came too soon. They made the journey to the new den, Thomas carrying cubs for the last time. The mother entered first, arranging the bedding, then emerged and looked at him. He understood. This was goodbye. Not forever, perhaps, but goodbye to this intense, impossible chapter of their shared story. He placed his hand on her head, feeling the thick fur, the powerful skull beneath. She pressed up into his touch, then stepped back. One by one, she carried the cubs into the den. Before taking the last one, the smallest female, she paused. She looked at the cub, then at Thomas, then back at the cub. The message was clear. This one lives because of you. Remember her. Then they were gone, vanishing into the cave that would be their home for the coming months. Thomas stood there for a long time, looking at the empty entrance, feeling a loss he couldn't name. Finally, he turned and walked back to his cabin, back to his normal life, carrying with him a secret that would reshape his understanding of the natural world. He thought that would be the end of it, a remarkable, unprecedented event that would remain his alone, unshared and unproven. He returned to his routine, his research, his data collection. But 3 weeks later, while checking his camera traps, he saw her. She was in one of the images, clear and unmistakable, the cubs playing around her feet. They had survived, were thriving. He began checking the camera obsessively, and occasionally he'd see them. The cubs grew rapidly, their spots becoming more defined, their movements more coordinated. 2 months after the storm, Thomas was hiking through a valley 5 miles from his cabin when he sensed he was being watched. He turned slowly and saw her on a ridge above him, sitting in plain view. No snow leopard did this. They didn't expose themselves to human observation. But she sat there, calm and deliberate, until he raised his hand in greeting. Then she stood and disappeared over the ridge. It became a pattern. Every few weeks, she'd appear when he was alone in the field. Never close enough to touch, never when he was with colleagues, but consistently enough that he knew it wasn't chance. She was checking on him, maintaining the connection they'd forged. 6 months after the storm, something happened that challenged everything Thomas thought he understood about animal behavior and communication. He was investigating reports of poaching activity in a remote valley when he found the snares. Dozens of them, professionally set, designed to catch snow leopards and wolves for the illegal fur trade. He was documenting them, preparing to call for backup to help remove them, when he heard her distinctive chirp. She was standing 50 feet away, and beside her was another snow leopard. A young male, not one of her cubs, but a full adult, and he was limping badly. His front paw was swollen to twice its normal size, infected, probably broken. The mother chirped again and started walking, looking back at Thomas expectantly. He followed, and she led him to a sheltered spot behind a cluster of boulders. There, the injured male collapsed, exhausted. The mother looked at Thomas, then at the injured leopard, then back at Thomas. The request was clear. Thomas examined the injured male carefully. The leopard was weak, dehydrated, but still dangerous. Yet he didn't resist as Thomas cleaned the infected wound, didn't flinch as antibiotics were injected, didn't fight as a splint was applied to the broken bones. It was as if the mother had somehow communicated that this human was safe, that he would help. For 3 days, Thomas returned to treat the injured male. The mother was always there, watching, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to calm the patient. On the 4th day, the male was strong enough to leave, limping but mobile. Before he left, he did something extraordinary. He approached Thomas, slowly, carefully, and rubbed his head against Thomas's leg, just once. Then he was gone. How had the mother found this injured male? Why had she cared enough to seek help for him? How had she communicated to him that Thomas was trustworthy? These questions had no answers within the current understanding of snow leopard behavior. Yet it had happened. Over the following year, it happened 3 more times. The mother would appear when Thomas was alone and lead him to injured or trapped animals. Not always snow leopards. Once a wolf caught in an old snare, once a golden eagle with a broken wing. Each time, she'd wait while he helped, then disappear without ceremony. The cubs grew rapidly, becoming independent hunters, learning the landscape of their territory. Thomas watched them through his cameras, documented their development without interference. The smallest female, the one he'd resuscitated, developed a distinctive hunting style, using strategy more than strength, perhaps compensating for her small size. One day, about 14 months after the storm, Thomas saw all 4 of them together one last time. The cubs were nearly adult-sized now, ready to disperse and establish their own territories. They were playing in a meadow, the mother watching from a rock. It was a scene of perfect natural beauty, a family that shouldn't have survived but did. The next week, the cubs began dispersing. The male left first, heading north into unclaimed territory. The larger female went east, but the smallest female stayed longer, shadowing her mother for an extra month before finally setting off to the south. Thomas lost track of them then, his camera network not extensive enough to follow their journeys. The mother remained, her territory now hers alone again. She and Thomas continued their strange relationship. Encounters every few weeks, always at her initiation. She aged gracefully, her injured leg never fully healing, but never stopping her either. She adapted, survived, thrived in her way. 3 years passed. Thomas published papers on snow leopard behavior, carefully omitting anything that might reveal his relationship with the mother. He gained recognition for his long-term studies, his understanding of their ecology. But the most important discoveries remained unshared, too extraordinary for scientific journals, too precious to risk. Then came another storm, not as severe as the one that had started everything but bad enough. Thomas was in his cabin, listening to the wind, when he heard the familiar scratching. He opened the door, expecting to see the mother. Instead, a young female snow leopard stood there, smaller than average, with distinctive markings on her shoulder. It was her, the smallest cub, the one he'd saved, now fully grown. And she was carrying a cub of her own. She entered his cabin with the same confidence her mother had shown, placed her cub by the warmth of the fire, and looked at Thomas expectantly. The cycle was beginning again, knowledge passed from mother to daughter, trust inherited like DNA. Thomas cared for this new generation as he had the previous one. The young mother stayed only 2 nights, the storm less severe, her need less desperate. But the connection was re-established, the bridge between species maintained. When she left, Thomas realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. Not just individual animals learning to trust a human, but the beginning of a cultural shift, a behavioral adaptation being passed down through generations. It challenged everything about how scientists understood animal behavior, learning, and the transmission of knowledge. He began to notice other signs. Snow leopards in his study area were becoming less elusive, more willing to be observed from a distance. They still avoided humans generally, but the panic response was diminished. When he set up cameras, he'd sometimes find tracks suggesting the leopards had investigated the equipment without triggering the motion sensors, as if they understood what the cameras were for and chose when to be seen. 5 years after the original storm, Thomas decided to take on a research assistant. Sarah Chun was brilliant, dedicated, and most importantly, she had the patience and respect for wildlife that the work required. Thomas told her nothing about his relationship with the leopards, wanted to see if she'd notice anything unusual on her own. It didn't take long. Within a month, Sarah was reporting unusual behavior patterns. Snow leopards approaching their research stations during storms. Mothers being remarkably tolerant of distant observation. Once, she swore a leopard had deliberately led her away from an unstable cliff edge, though she admitted it sounded crazy. Thomas listened to her reports with hidden satisfaction. The behavioral change was real, observable, reproducible. It wasn't just his imagination or wishful thinking. The snow leopards of these mountains were evolving, not physically but culturally, developing new strategies for coexistence with humans. One night, Sarah came to him with a question that showed she understood more than he'd realized. "They remember you, don't they?" she asked. "Specifically you. There's something different when you're in the field. They're watching you, but not like they watch me or the other researchers. They know you." Thomas considered his response carefully. Sarah was trustworthy, brilliant, and she'd already observed enough to draw conclusions. So he told her, not everything, but enough. About the storm, the mother, the cubs, the trust that had developed. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from skepticism to wonder to understanding. "That's why you never published about the behavioral changes," she said finally. "You're protecting them." She was right. Publication would bring attention, tourists, researchers, interference. The delicate trust being built would shatter under the weight of scientific scrutiny. But Sarah had a different idea. "What if we document it differently?" she suggested. "Not for publication, but for preservation. Create a record that could be released someday, when the world is ready, when it won't harm them." Together, they began building that record. Carefully, secretly, they documented the behavioral changes, the individual relationships, the transmission of knowledge through generations. They used hidden cameras, long-range observation, always careful not to interfere or exploit the trust being shown. The original mother was aging now, moving more slowly, her injured leg causing increasing difficulty. Thomas saw her less frequently, but their encounters remained meaningful. She'd appear sometimes just to sit near him while he worked, no interaction needed, just presence. One autumn day, 7 years after their first meeting, she led him to a high meadow he'd never visited before. The aspens were golden, the air crisp, the first snow dusting the peaks. She sat on a flat rock and waited for him to join her. They sat together for hours, watching the sun move across the sky. No sound but wind and distant birds. When she finally stood to leave, she did something she'd never done before. She walked directly to him and pressed her forehead against his chest, holding it there for several seconds. It was goodbye. Not temporary, not see you later, but goodbye. Thomas knew it with certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic. She walked away without looking back, moving stiffly but with dignity, disappearing into the golden trees. Thomas never saw her alive again. He found her the following spring. in a small cave near the meadow where they'd said goodbye. She died naturally, peacefully, her body positioned as if sleeping. Thomas sat with her for a long time, remembering everything she'd taught him about trust, communication, and the bridges possible between species. He buried her there, in that meadow, marking the spot with a cairn of stones that would mean nothing to anyone else. But sometimes, when he passed that way, he'd find fresh tracks around the cairn. Her descendants, perhaps, paying respects in their own way. The youngest daughter, the one he'd saved as a cub, continued the tradition her mother had started. She appeared regularly, sometimes bringing her own cubs during storms, sometimes just checking in. She lived to be remarkably old for a wild snow leopard, over 18 years, and through her, the connection persisted. Sarah eventually took over the research station when Thomas retired. She continued the work, documenting the ongoing behavioral evolution, protecting the secret while building evidence for future revelation. She reported that the leopards recognized her now, accepting her as they had accepted Thomas, though never quite with the same depth of trust. Other leopards from other regions began showing similar behaviors, suggesting the cultural transmission was spreading beyond the original family lines. Mothers were teaching daughters, and occasionally sons, that humans could be differentiated, that some could be trusted, that cooperation was possible. Thomas spent his retirement writing, not scientific papers but stories, fictionalized accounts of his experiences. Most people read them as fantasy, beautiful but imaginary tales of human-animal connection. But scattered throughout the world were readers who recognized truth when they encountered it, who understood that sometimes the most profound realities can only be shared as fiction. 20 years after that first storm, Thomas returned to the mountains one last time. He was old now, moving slowly like the mother leopard in her final years. Sarah drove him to his old cabin, now a modernized research station with multiple staff members. That night it snowed. Not a blizzard, just gentle flakes falling steadily. Thomas sat by the window, watching, remembering. Near midnight, he heard scratching at the door. A snow leopard stood there, young and healthy, with markings he didn't recognize. But in her mouth, she carried something that made his breath catch. A cub, tiny and vulnerable, maybe 2 weeks old. This leopard had never met him. Her grandmother might have, or her great-grandmother. But the knowledge had been passed down through generations. In desperate times, there was a place to go, humans who could be trusted, warmth, and help available for those brave enough to seek it. Thomas was too old to help directly, but he watched as Sarah took over, accepting the cub, providing warmth and care. The young mother entered without fear, generations of inherited memory, telling her this was safe. As Thomas watched this new chapter begin, he understood that what had started as an individual connection had become something larger. A bridge between species, built from necessity but maintained by choice. A proof that consciousness recognizes consciousness, that kindness transcends the boundaries we think separate us from the wild. The snow leopards of those mountains were no longer just solitary hunters, apex predators living and dying alone. They had become something new, something that didn't yet have a name in science. They were partners in survival, inheritors of trust, carriers of memory that spanned generations. And in their pale green eyes, watching from snowy ridges, approaching through storms, trusting despite every instinct that should make trust impossible, lived the proof that we are not as separate from nature as we believe. We are part of the same story, the same struggle for survival and meaning, the same capacity for connection that transcends species, time, and understanding. Thomas died 3 years later, peacefully, in his sleep. Sarah scattered his ashes in the meadow where the first mother was buried, the cairn now weathered but still standing. And that winter, during the first big storm, tracks appeared in the snow around both graves. Lots of tracks from multiple individuals, gathering as if to pay respects. The local people began to tell stories about the ghost leopards who remembered kindness, who helped lost hikers find their way, who appeared to those in need. Scientists dismissed these as folklore, anthropomorphism, wishful thinking. But in the mountains, Those who lived and worked closely with the land knew better. They knew that somewhere in those peaks, a population of snow leopards carried memories not their own, knowledge passed down mother to daughter, trust inherited like spots and fur. They knew that on stormy nights, these leopards might seek shelter with humans, not from desperation alone, but from cultural memory of kindness received and reciprocated. The full scientific documentation, thousands of hours of video, hundreds of pages of notes, remained sealed according to Thomas's and Sarah's wishes. It would be released eventually when the world was ready, when it wouldn't lead to exploitation or interference. But for now, the secret remained with the mountains, the snow, and the pale green eyes that watched from the ridges. In those mountains, the impossible had become normal. Snow leopards who remembered individual humans across generations. Mothers who taught daughters that not all humans were threats. Cubs who grew up knowing that in the worst storms, there was a place where help could be found. It had started with a single act of kindness, a man freeing a trapped leopard. It had continued with an act of trust, a desperate mother seeking help for dying cubs. It had evolved into something unprecedented, a cultural shift in how two species related to each other. And it persisted storm after storm, generation after generation, proof that the boundaries between wild and tame, human and animal, self and other, are constructs we've created rather than truths we've discovered. In the end, we are all consciousness looking out through different eyes, all capable of memory, choice, and connection. The snow leopards of those mountains know this. They carry it in their cells, their behavior, their cultural memory. They pass it to their cubs along with hunting techniques and territorial boundaries. And in doing so, they tell a story that science is only beginning to understand, a story about the possibility of connection across any divide, the power of kindness to reshape reality, and the truth that wild animals, indeed all conscious beings, never forget those who choose to help when help is needed most. The story continues today, in those mountains where snow falls and leopards ghost through the landscape. Researchers document behaviors that challenge textbooks. Local people share stories that sound like fantasy but carry the weight of truth. And somewhere, perhaps during the next great storm, another leopard will approach another door, carrying another cub, continuing a tradition that began with trust and continues with the understanding that we are not separate from nature, but part of it, connected in ways we are only beginning to understand. This is their legacy, Thomas's and the first mothers, carried forward in paw prints in snow, in pale green eyes watching from ridges, in the scratch at the door during storms. It's a legacy that says consciousness recognizes consciousness, kindness transcends species, and the wild remembers those who choose to help. And in remembering, they change us all.